Britain has already been attacked by Russia multiple times. And so the most important thing we can do is to not get rattled by these provocations. But that's not to say that we should dismiss Russian threats outright, right? Just because something hasn't happened in the past doesn't necessarily mean that it won't happen in the future. You can't just let the Russians keep doing these things and Britain or Europe will just sort of get used to it, right? That's a shaping operation. And we can't let the Russians shape how we think about what they're willing to do. So if the Russians were to sort of respond in kind with energy infrastructure, they would have to do it in at least a plausibly deniable way, or at least a semi-implausibly deniable way. Their whole purpose is to create doubt in NATO, right? That NATO would actually respond. And Russia could attack the UK, but I don't really think that that's the primary worry in terms of a conventional attack. I think what your listeners need to understand is that there's many ways to attack the UK. And so I would encourage you to not think about attack as a word that sort of describes the Blitz or some sort of World War II or high-end conventional fight. In fact, Britain has already been attacked by Russia multiple times, right? There have been assassinations, there have been cyber attacks, there's been meddling with infrastructure, there's been political subversion. I mean, Russia is in a sense attacking the UK all the time, but we have this sense in the West that attack means tanks and planes and sort of the conventional sense of that word. And so we're actually not really using the right vocabulary when we're talking about attack, because we're not talking about cyber operations, digital meddling, assassination plots, sabotage, right, of warehouses supporting Ukrainian military efforts, and on and on. So if you want to ask, could Russia attack the UK in a conventional sense? Yes, it could, but I think it would be foolish to do so. And so this mixes up capability and intent. So does Russia have the capability to attack the UK? Yes, it does. Does it have the intent to attack the UK? I think it doesn't, because Russia cannot have an attack on the UK that would trigger a collective Article 5 NATO response, which then helps us understand why Putin is always attacking the UK in what we call hybrid or asymmetric or sub-threshold or gray zone. There's all of these terms floating around, but the whole point of those terms is to keep the level of war below the conventional level of war. So instead of thinking about war as at war or at peace, in the West we sort of have this binary, right? We are at peace until we are at war. And the Russians don't really think about it in such clean ways. There's a spectrum of competition. And so the Russians are happy to sort of go up and down this spectrum. And there's lots of things on it, right? From literally good relations all the way, of course, up to outright conventional war. And so the Russians escalate up and down this spectrum. And so when we use words like at war or at peace, we're sort of obfuscating what the Russians are really doing in the UK. Well, subthreshold attacks are not inherently more or less dangerous, because there is an escalatory path, and the Russians are happy to be on that path. What's a little bit scary is that the Russians exploit our fears about escalation. And so anytime the Brits or other countries do something to support Ukraine, then the Russians, sort of threaten something that's going to be terrible, right? And they rattle the saber, be it nuclear weapons or whatever else they try to do to scare us. And so the most important thing we can do is to not get rattled by these provocations. But that's not to say that we should dismiss Russian threats outright, right? Just because something hasn't happened in the past doesn't necessarily mean that it won't happen in the future, right? So these threats are concerning, and they should be concerning, but they are not. They shouldn't lead us off of the course that the British politicians of both parties, both major parties, I should add, have set, right, which is essentially unconditional support for Ukraine. And that's been a very consistent British policy since the full-scale invasion in February of 2022. And so I'm not saying that there's not a cost or that Britain wouldn't have a danger. There are often costs to doing what, in my view, is the right thing, right, in terms of supporting Ukraine. So this policy may not be cost-free, right? The British may suffer cyber attacks, airspace incursions, maritime provocations, any number of ills that the Russians may be willing to do below the threshold of conventional conflict, right, in order to avoid triggering a NATO Article 5 collective response. So the Russians are going to do those things, and they have done those things. But that doesn't mean, right, just because Russia has a nuclear weapon or is willing to escalate, right, if we capitulate to those fears, right, then the Russians will have learned the lesson that they can do whatever they want in what they view as their own sphere of influence, and we just have to sit there and take it. And so the most important thing to do, right, and this is just kindergarten 101, right, this isn't rocket science. Bullies respond to strength, and Britain needs to prepare. You can't just let the Russians keep doing these things, and Britain or Europe will just sort of get used to it, right? That's a shaping operation, and we can't let the Russians shape how we think about what they're willing to do. Well, to avoid Russian escalation or continued Russian provocations, the UK and NATO, they have to stand firm, they have to stand strong, because it's not just Ukraine, right? Ukraine has a special place in Putin's imagination. But even if we were to just sort of let Ukraine go into Putin's orbit, and I mean stop supporting them, of course they would keep fighting for their own sovereignty. But it would be a dreadful policy mistake to stop supporting Ukraine. So the problem that Putin now has is that, in a very narrow sense, the Russians are right. That Lavrov is right, that they are not just fighting Ukraine, right? They are fighting many Western countries that have supported Ukraine, right? That's true. And by the way, it's only fair to add that the Russians have support from China, from Iran, from Belarus, and other backers that the Russians have. But the Western support for Ukraine, combined with Ukraine's own bravery and ingenuity, is creating real strategic problems for Putin, right? This was supposed to be over, this so-called special military operation. This was supposed to be over in 3 days, right? And so it's a failure on its own terms. And 5 years into this, Russia has very serious questions to answer, for instance, about why Moscow or St. Petersburg or oil refineries or Wildberries warehouses, many hundreds of kilometers away from the front lines, are now being attacked, right? And so the Ukrainians are trying to bring the war home to Russia, and they're doing a good job of that. And so Putin's problem is now to bring the war home to Britain or to Poland or to any backer of the Ukrainians, right? And so what he wants to do is he wants to separate out Ukraine from its backers, because if he can do that, he has a better chance of dominating Ukraine. And so his threats to the UK and to NATO and to others are all about separating Ukraine from its backers, because then Ukraine would be less of a handful for the Russians at the moment. So what we've seen from the Ukrainians is that they are targeting Russian energy infrastructure. And of course, the Russians are going to respond, particularly this winter, with really merciless attacks on the Ukrainian power grid and infrastructure. The Ukrainians are using a mixture of their own capabilities and British and other Western-backed capabilities for deep strike into Moscow. And this is a huge problem for Putin for lots of reasons, right? Not only are Russians having long gas lines, their Wildberries deliveries are not coming as scheduled. Russian gas and oil exports are continuing to be harmed. And so the question then comes up, should the Russians, or could the Russians, or would the Russians in return, strike energy infrastructure in NATO countries or in the West. I'm certainly not ruling it out, but it wouldn't be done in the same way, right? So the Russians need to operate in deniability, and there's two kinds of deniability. There's plausible deniability, where we really just don't know who took a particular action, right? We can think about that with maybe cyber operations, or for a while with the Nord Stream sabotage, right, in the Baltic Sea, right? Who's responsible? We really just can't say for certain. Then there's implausible deniability, where it's pretty clear that we know who did it, right? So in this case, the Russians, if they're blowing up weapons warehouses, for instance, in the UK or in the Czech Republic or in Slovakia or wherever it is that they are trying to rail infrastructure, right? They want to damage rail infrastructure in Poland, for instance, because that's where a lot of Ukrainian military supplies transit. So if the Russians were to sort of respond in kind with energy infrastructure, they would have to do it in at least a plausibly deniable way, or at least a semi-implausibly deniable way. Their whole purpose is to create doubt in NATO, right? That NATO would actually respond. And so if you do something that's, with just for instance, right, with marked, Russian fighter jets that make it very clear that Russia is responsible for an attack on NATO territory, right, on a NATO member state, NATO would have to respond, right? And Russia can't deal with that. Russia can't even get past the Donbass in Ukraine, right? So this idea that there's some sort of, further attack coming on Ukrainian, beyond Ukrainian territory onto NATO territory, I don't think that's a thing, right? So if we think about threat, I like to describe this as if you are, let's say you're in a military context and you want to dig in, right? You want to get into the ground, right, for safety. But what if you're facing, for instance, a flood, right? Then digging in doesn't actually help you, and you've misunderstood the threat that's coming at you. And I think we in the West often misunderstand the nature of the threat. The Russian threat is not going to be conventional against NATO. It's going to be airspace provocations, sabotage to pipelines, sabotage to undersea infrastructure, cyber operations. I mean, Putin is a Chekist. And what I mean by that is that Putin is a former intelligence officer. He's a former KGB officer. And he views the world, right, in terms of this sub-threshold intelligence and special operations-led contest. And so the first tool that we reach for in the West, and particularly in the US, is the military tool of statecraft. In Russia, the first tool that Putin reaches for, the first tool of statecraft that Putin reaches for is his intelligence services and the special operations bits of his intelligence services. That's how he engages the world. And so that's what we can expect from any sort of Russian attack, right? It would be attacks in domains that are not the sort of land, conventional domains. But it is correct to say that Putin will try to test NATO, to probe NATO through airspace violations or any other number of provocations to really see where NATO's red lines are. And we are learning, for instance, through the provision of military capabilities to Ukraine, we're learning what Putin's red lines are, right? And the British, have been very, very strong, right? They've taken a real moral stand to continue to supply Ukraine, regardless of Putin's threats. And what we've seen then is breaking through taboo after taboo after taboo, right? So just as a, for instance, we can't provide, the argument goes, right, well, we can't provide lethal aid to Ukraine, for instance, in January of 2022, right? And the Americans supplied anti-tank weapons. The British supplied the NLAW anti-tank weapons. Then the Brits supplied Starstreak. And then the Brits kept going, right? The Brits provided Challenger 2s, a main battle tank, which then opens the way to break the taboo so that Leopards, for instance, can be provided to Ukraine, so that an Abrams can be provided to Ukraine. So the Brits have been first to break through a lot of these so-called taboos because we're afraid of what Putin's red lines are. Does he have red lines? I'm sure he does. But so far, the ones that he's claimed to be red lines, we've broken through. And again, thanks to British leadership, we've broken through, and this has unlocked other aid for Ukraine that has come from other states who have been afraid to act as a first mover in the way that Britain has not been afraid to act as a first mover.